things were really, really good.
I could tell how happy she was.
My parents, they got concerned.
She had to choose between Joe or her family.
He was losing control.
That was when he finally went full psycho.
The scene itself just looked like a nightmare.
When I looked at him, it wasn't human. It was evil.
911, where's your emergency?
Oh, God, you gotta get someone over here. Why would you do something like this?
Morgantown for me has always been like a place of community. Everyone is everyone's neighbor. And honestly, like if you don't know anybody there, it won't take 5 seconds before you already have a friend. Like it's that kind of community.
My mom and dad moved us here in 91, 92. It was a fabulous place to be raised. I love raising my kids there.
We were all living in one house. It was my mom and papa, and then my sister, my parents, and then my mom's siblings, and then Angie's kids were there as well.
Angie had a boyfriend in high school, and they actually went on to have 2 children. And then things did not work out between them, and they separated. Well, our parents were not exactly thrilled because both of us became young mothers. They basically were 100% supportive. Yep, we were very, very close.
Angie was the best sister. Me and her, we're only 2 years apart. With her, she was my best friend.
She was free-spirited. A rainy day, she came into the room, you would never thought it was raining.
Oh, Angie was a firecracker. She always had the loudest laugh. That was just infectious.
So me and Angie, we went and got food. And she said, I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell mom and dad. I was like, okay, lay it on me. What do we got? And she's like, I've met someone. I was like, well, okay, like, what's his name? Joey.
I remember her saying that he had come to her work and he was kind of like following her around the store, maybe found her attractive.
Angie was very into like the emo scene, dark clothes. She was like a rocker girl. Joey was very much that rocker type boy.
I remember it like when she brought him over. Mom was very on the defensive, very protective. And dad was like, well, let's play this out and see, prove to me that you're a decent person, prove to me that you're good enough to date my daughter kind of thing. I talked to Joey about that, and I went up to him and I was like, she really likes you, she really cares about you. Please be good to her. He said that he would.
I remember the first time that I met Joey. I was at my mom and papa's house, and I was sitting in the living room, and that's when Angie walked in with Joey. I remember he leaned down to show me the tattoo he had on his shoulder, and it was a 666 tattoo. I remember his exact words to me were, I got this tattoo to show that even in good, there's always some evil.
Growing up in Morgantown, a small community, we were raised Christian, so when I seen him with all kinds of tattoos, I was like, okay, I don't know really how to feel about this.
Morgantown is very small, pretty tight-knit community. Everybody knows everybody, basically.
I think with Joey, it was outside of the norm of what you would expect to see in really anybody in our community. it kind of drew Angie in the sense of like this was something different.
She seemed happy. It was a, new relationship, and things were really, really good. In 2012, Angie and Joey decided that they were going to get married.
I asked her, "Are you sure you want to do this? Does he make you happy?" And she said, "Yeah, he does."
We did a little reception at my uncle's house, and everything went really well. I think in the beginning, she seemed happy. He treated her older two kids okay, and I think that we were happy that she was happy.
We were absolutely delighted. And nice to see, her and all the kids, just happy.
Angie decided she wanted to be a certified nursing assistant. She loved it. She loved it so much.
Her and I worked together at a long-term care and rehab facility. Angie not only, worked her full-time hours, but she worked overtime every single week. A lot of times we would go in together and we would actually work like doubles, which are 16-hour shifts.
My sister, was working almost every day. But later on in the relationship, we started seeing he would not work. He wouldn't work.
I remember he got a job one time at, I believe it was a UPS shipping facility. He worked there for maybe a few months, and then he quit. And then his reason for quitting was that it was boring, and that was it.
What made me more mad than anything was that Joey would get mad when she took days off, when she didn't pick up a shift. He said it was lost money, money that she wasn't bringing in.
He liked being home. He liked, only doing those bare minimal things, and that Angie not only paid all the bills, but she got to where she was even giving him an allowance.
He told everybody that it was because he was a stay-at-home dad.
The house never got cleaned, and I remember that. I saw that. The house was a wreck. The kids were in dirty clothes. Laundry wasn't done. I wish I would have said something then. But, Angie was doing everything that she could.
This man didn't even have, a driver's license. If he needed to go anywhere or needed to be dropped off, he had to wake Angie up to do it.
The more I got to hang out over there, I guess Joey felt like he could be more comfortable with, me around. Playing on, video games, he would get, violent, yell, throw the controller. And so for me, it was if he's acting like this, now, what's he doing behind closed doors? Angie, I was like, is he violent towards you? Does he yell at you? Does he hit you? All the time it was, no, he doesn't do anything like that. Joey wouldn't do that. Something in my gut was just I don't like him.
I started asking questions, and then Angie kind of lost contact with us.
My parents, they got concerned. Even her phone had been shut off, or she had gotten a new phone number, and so no one had a way of communicating with her.
Looking back, I guess that was the beginning of him just trying to gain control. Just trying to maybe distance Angie from mom and dad.
My whole family, if there's a reason for us to get together and celebrate something, we're gonna do it. We have 50 people that show up for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, and all of a sudden she was not showing up to those things.
He just kind of, slowly did it over time. It was, oh, I don't want to go. If you go, you're saying that it's okay that they don't like me, that they treat me differently. Then she would be guilted into staying home. Joe definitely had put a lot of strain on Angie with making her feel as if she had to choose between Joe or her family.
Me, mom, dad, everybody, was blocked. Like on Facebook, phone numbers, all that.
I remember mom crying about it. I remember dad crying about it.
I remember they were in the church parking lot and we had pulled up to park and we went to say hi. Joey, kind of shoved the kids in the car, shoved Angie, and they sped out of there. And I remember my mom and papa being just so upset because they just wanted to see their daughter and their grandkids. And I was worried for my Aunt Angie. I was worried for my cousins.
That is what prompted her mom to reach out to the Child Protective Services.
That's whenever, I guess you'd say, everything started hitting the fan.
The house was a wreck. It was disgusting. It was awful. Honestly, if social services had seen the house like that, those kids would have been removed right then and there, no questions asked.
It really did escalate because my parents were so immersed in their grandkids' lives that someone to just say, no, you're not seeing your grandkids anymore, was just heartbreaking for my parents. They were the type of grandparents that always wanted their grandkids around them. They were happiest when they had all their grandkids around them.
I think for mom and dad, they feared for the safety of the kids, and I think they knew that maybe they could do something to help those babies.
I think her mom thought, if I can get the kids out of there, then Angie will follow. But that didn't happen. Joe was able to really spin that and make it to where her mom was now the enemy.
Her kids had practically been raised in and around my parents' home. All of a sudden, they were not allowed to be around any of our family.
Mom and dad not seeing the grandbabies hurt mom and dad more than anything else. I remember Angie reaching out to dad. She came to the house and she started crying and she hugged dad. And she's like, I'm so sorry for everything that I had done. It was heartwarming, I guess. But it felt good because it was a bridge. It may not have been a sturdy bridge, but it was a start.
She finally started to come back around, and Joey would also come around with her. They would typically visit for about an hour at a time. It would be an hour on the dot, and Joey was, okay, it's time to go. We need to go home now. It was like she was a prisoner, and this was her hour of recess. In 2013, Angie and Joey had their first kid together. That was Violet, a little girl. And then they had their second child, Archer.
I think that she really thought that maybe that was going to make him change his ways, that maybe things would turn around.
Shortly after she had Violet, I remember her telling me she couldn't be around any other men at all without Joe. He would, go through her phone, her text messages, her Facebook, and then that would turn into, a confrontation with him. He would push her, he would hold her up against the wall. When he got something in his head and wanted to fight about something, there was no getting away. She had tried to leave before, and he would tell her that if she didn't come back or if she didn't talk to him, that he would kill himself, that it would be her fault.
She did leave Joey for a very short amount of time. She moved in with Mama and Papa and all of us with her kids. That was when she started to explain, Joey is abusive. He refused to get a job, and that when she would get paid, he would take control of her paychecks and her bank accounts and basically just leave Angie with just enough money for the bills. We were all just kind of leave him. You cannot put yourself through this. You can't put your kids through this. You have to get out of this relationship. And she would be like, I'm going to. And then she ended up going back with him.
It seemed like it was just a back and forth, and it became almost exhausting, where it was they'd be okay for a couple of months, there'd be a fight, she'd leave. She'd stay at Mom and Dad's for a few days, they'd make up. It was a cycle. It was a cycle.
Every time she would run away from him, she would run to my parents. And so there was always just that fear that, well, they're going to be caught up in the middle of this.
Joey would send threats all the time, telling her, I'm going to put a bullet in your brain, your mom's brain, and your dad's brain if you ever leave me.
Joey came to the point where he was being more aggressive, being more violent, and Angie, she knew she couldn't do anything if she was dead. She couldn't protect her babies if she was gone.
So Angie had called me on Facebook. I messaged her as soon as I had woken up. And I was like, hey, what did you call for? And then she said protection. Joe had me pinned in the bathroom. It got so bad.
That was the straw that broke the camel's back. This was when she said, I've got to get out of here. I've got to do something to get out of this.
I knew that he was going to do something. I knew he was going to take matters in his own hands, and I was scared for him.
We are all at my cousin Brene's house, and we've got, a fire going, and we're roasting marshmallows. I see my mom answering her phone, and I said, what's going on? She said, don't say anything. Angie left Joey. And again, in my mind, I'm just like, oh, here we go again, for the umpteenth time.
I sat there and I remember saying, I was like, I won't believe it until the divorce papers are signed. I told them that. I was like, I won't hold my breath.
She was different this time, and she was done. And it was very evident that she was done.
I asked, I was like, well, how's he taking it? And she was like, oh, he won't stop blowing up my phone. Like, I have to literally, like, put him on, like, do not disturb. And I'm like, really? Like, that much? And I was like, so now that he realizes what he's done and what a piece of trash he is, now he wants to come running back. And Angie's just like, he's got nowhere to run to. She was like, I'm done with him. I loved hearing that. That was like a weight off my shoulder.
Those first couple of months, I was skeptical and I was thinking, okay, like, this probably isn't gonna last long, but I'll just enjoy it while it is, you know? Then, you know, it kind of got to that point where it had been the longest she was away, and I could tell how happy she was.
It's like 7 a.m. I'm sitting there in bed and I just, hear, a knock at my door. Then the door just opens and like she's standing there, hands on her hips. She goes, "New me. The world is my oyster." She's like, and I am finally taking a hold of my life.
We were thrilled. I mean, the whole family, it was basically like a party. I mean, we were so happy that she had left him.
Angie eventually met somebody new, and when I say that he was a complete 180 from Joey, I'm happy to say that he was. Like, she didn't have a bad word to say about him,
Wes, I mean, he loved her so much. He was just smitten with her. He treated her nice. He wasn't pushing her out the door, saying, it's time to go, it's time to leave. He just had a great relationship with all of us, Christmas was really great. We had everybody there. And it was probably one of the most, like, stress-free Christmases that we had had, especially with Angie. We knew she was done with Joey. We knew that this chapter was kind of closing, and we were just so happy for her, happy for her kids, and it was just really great. I think she finally opened her eyes to, what he's doing is wrong. It's always been wrong. I can get out of this situation and be okay. And I think that's when she finally decided to put in the divorce paperwork.
When she finally decided to divorce him, he wouldn't sign the papers. But I know for a fact that she did. She had a lawyer. She had everything. She even sat there, got a new phone number, got a new bank account, like everything to separate from him.
His state of mind at that point when the divorce papers were coming was not good. He was angry. He was just constantly texting my sister, calling my sister, harassing my sister.
When she wasn't answering, he was calling her oldest daughter. He would call her mom, and then he was calling her dad. I mean, they weren't even able to use their phones because he was just constantly calling.
He was losing control at that point, I think, and that's what started to scare him.
Joey started to tell Angie that he was depressed and that he wanted to kill himself, and started saying like some very disturbing things.
He threatened to drink bleach. He also made the comment that he was going to do it whenever he had the kids.
She told him She doesn't feel comfortable leaving the kids with him by himself because she was worried that he might actually kill himself in front of them, and she didn't want her kids to see that. And so she told him, like, I need you to get help. I'm gonna keep the kids away for a little bit. I think that was when he finally went full psycho.
He did threaten her life. He said, like, if I can't have you, no one can. He threatened mom and dad. One point he said, if there was a real life purge, he was like, I'd go to your mom and dad's house and kill them.
Her lawyer did suggest that she gets a emergency protective order against Joe. Her and her lawyer had decided it was best to have no contact, no telling Joe where the kids were, of what, they were, what they were doing. It was basically just gonna go cold turkey.
Myself, my parents, we all said, we're scared for you. We're scared for you, Angie. I'm scared of what he's gonna do. What if he shows up?
This is one of the texts that Joe had sent. Okay, I'll give it to the end of the day. Then, like I said 2 days ago, I tried to play nice, tried to leave it be, but now you are not replying and not answering, so I will be handling things accordingly. Reading this, I don't think that she was thinking that this meant that he was going to show up with a gun to her home, but now we know that that's exactly what he meant.
Where's your emergency?
Oh my God, my son! Oh God, you gotta get someone over here!
Ma'am, what is your address? Where's your emergency?
Oh my God, my son! Oh God, you gotta get someone over here! I just brought my son here to pick up the kids. Oh, why would you do something like this? Jesus Christ. Oh my God. Oh
Ma'am, ma'am, I can't understand you. Now, is it your son that was shot or her?
Her.
My cousin is at home. Her husband is on fire and rescue, so he has a police scanner, and it came across that there was a male not breathing on Lonnie Snodgrass Road. They even gave the exact address.
I was in my office when I got a message from my cousin. I got told that an ambulance is heading to my house.
My dad had COPD, he was 79, he had health issues. I actually thought that it was something with my dad.
I was working at the hospital, and my brother Jonathan calls. He sounded troubled, and he was like, Tony, I think something's going on with mom and dad. Can you go check on them? Can you go and see them? And I was like, okay, yeah.
I reached my niece, and she said, Joey showed up with a gun. She said, Mama told me to grab the baby and go to the closet and lock the door.
Please leave your message.
I'm calling my mom, and I'm calling my mom, and I'm calling my mom, and she doesn't answer.
I was at work that day when I got the call from the Kentucky State Police that we'd had a homicide. When I got to the home and made entry into the home, obviously it was unlike any crime scene I'd ever been to before.
The current time is 11:10 at the scene of a shooting. Be doing a walk through the residence.
As you breach the door threshold, Miss Carey was located prone on her back. She had substantial wounds evident of gunfire. A few further feet inside the residence was Miss McGranahan. To the area on the wall and just above her head was a blood pattern impact that indicated that she had been shot at close range. Located on the couch of that residence were multiple casings, indicating that Joseph Carey had entered the threshold of that door prior to firing on Lupe McGranahan.
We're currently in the living room area, transitioning into the dining room, kitchen, magazine floor, multiple shell casings.
As you made your way in through the residence, was various casings scattered across the living room and the dining room floor, kind of indicating the path that Joseph Carey would have taken as he had entered the residence.
This is the laundry room area. Additional individuals deceased.
Chuck, he actually was located inside the utility room.
It appears that the incident was contained to the interior of the residence and the front driveway.
You know, the scene itself just looked like a nightmare and a normal life of people that had been interrupted by, just a horrific event.
They already had a state trooper that was blocking the road. And so I pulled in.
We get there, I see some ambulances, and I keep thinking that like my mom or dad are gonna come out of this ambulance.
A first aid responder, she just looks at me and she's like, starts shaking her head and she's like, "I'm so sorry." She told me that Joseph Carey showed up with a gun and shot and killed my sister, my mom, and my dad.
My brother comes to me and he says, "They're all gone." And I said, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "What do you mean they're all gone?" And he said, Joey showed up and they're all gone. I didn't really know what to do at that point.
We remember seeing Joey get taken in a police car. I remember that. I'll never forget. I locked eyes with him too. And when I looked at him, it wasn't human. It was evil.
The police already had him in custody, and he was transported from the scene to the state police post where they conducted a full interview.
We now needed to determine what would cause Joseph Carey to essentially execute all three individuals of his very close and immediate family.
I wasn't there. I didn't get to speak to you the first time. So if you could just walk me through your day, kind of let me know what happened and what your thought process was.
I went down to go speak to Angela. That was the mother of my kids, my wife. She came to the door with the door closed and was like, "You need to leave." I said, "Can I just see the kids? That's all I want." She said, "You can talk to them through the door."
Mr. Carey, he had stated that he'd gone to the residence to get the children. I believe they were in the process of getting a divorce, and that he was trying to see the children.
And then that's when Lupe, Angela's mother, told Chuck to get the shotgun because I was staying too long. And that's when everything kind of went chaotic. She said, "Go get the shotgun." And I seen him passing through to the actual laundry room where I knew they kept the shotgun.
I think Mr. Carey wanted to convey to us that he had made those actions because he had been forced to make those actions.
The Wood thing that you're saying escalated the situation today was Loopy telling Chuck to go get the shotgun.
Yes. I was trying to save myself and the kids, and what went through my mind was just not letting him get a shotgun where he could do something. I don't even know how in my mind my solution was better. I should have ran or something.
Has Chuck ever pulled a shotgun on you before?
No.
Kerry stated multiple times that his primary concern with Chuck is that he was going to retrieve specifically a shotgun in the house that he knew or suspected to be located in the utility room of the residence. Chuck did enter that utility room. There was a shotgun present in that utility room. However, it wasn't loaded.
I mean, can't tell you any more than what I've already told you, really. I just said get the shotgun. I panicked. I did. My anxiety kills me most of the time, and when I heard that, my heart rate went, whoop. I followed him. I just, boom, 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 right, you can boom, 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 right, and then boom, boom, boom.
I'll interject this. I'm willing to play to buy your I panic story. I'll buy it. She had no firearm. She didn't accost you. She didn't assault you. She was in no way, shape, or form even arguably a threat.
Yeah.
She made no motion to a firearm.
No.
And you shot her.
Yes.
I think it's very important to remember that Angie McGranahan and Lupe McGranahan were found in very close proximity to one another, neither one of them having a gun on them, and that he had no right, Joseph Carey, to take their lives or to come in that home at all, even if he thought someone was going to get a gun.
So I've been listening to what you're telling me, okay? And some of the stuff's not adding up, okay?
Okay. I'll tell you right now, I'm guilty of what I did. I'm not gonna sit there and around and say I didn't hurt him or kill him.
Well, I mean, we know that. What we're trying to understand is why.
I'm telling you it was panic, but I ain't gonna lie to you, there's probably more to it than that. But I honestly jumped when I heard the shotgun thing. That was just after the perceived threat.
Well, you was after one of three.
Well, I understand that, but I'm saying that was my main goal, was to stop him.
But what I'm getting at is Lupe was this way, he was this way.
I get you.
Your wife was here, he was this way.
I get you.
I think he was very much aware of the decisions that he was making while he was present. I think he was aggravated with the custody agreement, and possibly emotions were slightly elevated upon hearing that his kids would potentially be taken from him.
After I shot Chuck, I walked back by Angie, and that's when I heard the Google noise. That was bothering me a lot. And I think, I can't tell you for sure, but I do think I did shoot again to get it to stop.
He was charged with 2 counts murder, 1 count murder, domestic violence, and I believe 3 counts of wanton endangerment. The Commonwealth of Kentucky is a death penalty state, and we knew most likely, just given the numbers of deceased individuals on scene, that would most definitely be something pursued by the Commonwealth's office.
When the suggestion of death penalty came up for Joey, I was in full support of it. The sooner he's dead, the better. I'm not gonna lie, the plea deal turned my stomach. After the evil you committed, you somehow still think that you're worthy of a plea. It was only after Blake explained that with a plea deal, it's done, it's over, there was no appealing. It was life in prison without the possibility of parole.
In looking at intent in a case like this, of what Mr. Carey's intent might have been, I believe he went to that residence to kill Angie McGranahan. I believe that Lupe and Chuck's deaths were just a result of them being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Joseph Carey shot Angie simply because she made it very clear that he was not going to have access to the children.
It was obvious that this was really just a cold-blooded, brutal murder of 3 people, 3 lives taken away from a family. That just really added another level to me of evil.
He was a monster. And they were three beautiful souls who were loved and just missed every single day. And every day is hard without them, even now.
They were definitely a safety net for me. You know, I felt like I was a tightrope walker, you know, and if I did fall, like, they were there.
My sister lived for her kids and ultimately died for her kids. And there's no greater sacrifice, you know.
I can't sum up one thing I miss about Angie. I miss my best friend. I miss my storyteller, my secret keeper, my confidant. Because she was that and more. And not a day goes by that I don't think about them.
It begins with a sound New York never forgets, even when it pretends to move on. The low, distant hum of traffic at dawn, the kind that seeps through brick walls and half-open windows, the city breathing while one apartment stays unnaturally still, a silence so complete it feels staged, as if someone carefully arranged it overnight. On a cold March morning in 2001, in a narrow residential block where neighbors nodded but rarely spoke, that silence wrapped itself around a small third-floor walk-up and refused to let go. Inside, a young woman did not answer her phone. Her bed was made. Her shoes were lined neatly by the door. Her purse sat where it always did. And yet, she was gone. No note. No sign of struggle. No broken lock. Just absence, clean and terrifying. Within hours, the word missing would harden into something heavier, something the community would whisper instead of say out loud. Cold case. Not yet, they didn't know it. But the clock had already started. The building smelled faintly of old paint and radiator heat when police arrived, the kind of place that remembered too many lives. Officers moved carefully, not because they sensed danger, but because nothing looked wrong, and that, somehow, was worse. The apartment told a story of routine, coffee mug rinsed and drying, mail stacked by the door, yesterday's newspaper folded to the metro section. No blood. No chaos. No obvious theft. The kind of scene that investigators dread because it offers no clear direction, only questions that multiply the longer you stare. Who leaves like this? Who disappears without touching a single thing? Outside, a neighbor leaned out a window, watching, already forming a version of events in their head. By noon, patrol cars lined the curb, and by nightfall, the entire block knew a name they would repeat for years, sometimes with hope, sometimes with resignation. She was 27. A native New Yorker. Known for routines, for punctuality, for calling her mother every Sunday night without fail. She worked a modest job, paid her rent on time, smiled at the bodega owner downstairs. No known enemies. No dangerous habits. Friends would later say the same thing over and over, as if repetition could protect them from suspicion. She wasn't reckless, she wasn't secretive, she wasn't planning to run away. Investigators asked about boyfriends, exes, coworkers, anyone who might fit the shape of a motive, but nothing landed with weight. The city, so often accused of swallowing people whole, seemed, in this case, almost offended by the suggestion. New York doesn't make people vanish like this. Not quietly. Not without witnesses. And yet, the longer the day stretched on, the clearer it became that whatever had happened did not want to be seen. The first lead came and went like a subway train, fast, loud, and ultimately useless. A reported sighting near a bus terminal. Another near a park. Each tip raised pulses, sent officers rushing across boroughs, only to collapse under scrutiny. Grainy security footage offered shapes without faces, movement without meaning. Phone records showed nothing unusual. Her last call was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of conversation you forget 5 minutes after hanging up. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, collecting half-memories and polite shrugs. Someone heard a noise. Someone thought they saw a man on the stairs. Someone else remembered nothing at all. The problem with a dense city is not a lack of people, it's too many stories overlapping, blurring into noise. And in that noise, the truth can hide comfortably. As days turned into weeks, the case shifted. Posters went up on lampposts, her face staring back at commuters who rarely met her eyes. Vigils were held on sidewalks slick with rain. Candles flickered, went out, were relit. Detectives followed the obvious paths first: former relationships, workplace disputes, financial stress. None of it stuck. Her bank account showed no sudden withdrawals. Her passport was still in the apartment. She hadn't packed a bag. This wasn't an escape. This wasn't a planned disappearance. It felt surgical, as if someone had reached into her life and removed only one thing, her, leaving everything else untouched. Then there were the people who knew her best. Family, friends. Neighbors she trusted enough to share keys with. Faces that didn't belong on wanted posters because they belonged at dinner tables, in holiday photos, in the quiet background of a normal life. Police asked questions carefully, aware of the line between investigation and accusation. Everyone cooperated. Everyone expressed shock. Everyone had an alibi that sounded reasonable, even kind. In 2001, the tools were limited. DNA databases were smaller. Digital footprints were faint. Text messages were rare. Social media didn't exist to betray patterns. What investigators had instead were instincts, and instincts, without proof, can only go so far. The case cooled. Not officially, not yet, but in the way that matters: fewer detectives assigned, fewer hours logged, fewer fresh leads pinned to the board. Her family felt the shift before anyone admitted it. Phone calls slowed. Updates became less frequent. The city moved on, because cities always do, and grief, when it lasts too long, makes people uncomfortable. Years passed. Her name drifted into the category of unresolved, spoken occasionally in hushed tones, filed under what happened to alongside dozens of others. A cold case in waiting, gathering dust while life continued around it, indifferent and loud. But even cold cases breathe. They wait. Somewhere, evidence sat boxed and labeled, fingerprints preserved, fibers catalogued, statements transcribed and forgotten. Somewhere, a detail that meant nothing in 2001 waited for a future context that didn't exist yet. Detectives retired. New ones took their place. Technology advanced quietly, relentlessly, reshaping what was possible. DNA became louder. Databases grew. Old assumptions began to look fragile under new light. And every so often, someone would pull the file, read through it again, feel that familiar frustration settle in their chest. The scene that was too clean. The absence that was too complete. The people who were too close to notice. The community never fully let it go. Anniversaries brought small mentions in local papers. True crime forums, years later, would dissect the case with amateur precision, arguing theories late into the night. Stranger abduction. Secret life. Trusted insider. Each theory said more about the fear of the person proposing it than about the evidence itself. Because the evidence, stubbornly, refused to point in a single direction. And that was the most unsettling part. Not that something terrible had happened, but that it could happen so quietly, so close, without leaving a trail. By the time 2 decades had passed, the case had become a ghost, haunting the margins of official memory. But ghosts have a way of returning when least expected. A re-examined sample. A new match. A name that suddenly resurfaced, no longer shielded by familiarity. In the early 2000s, no one had the language to describe what investigators would later see with chilling clarity. The danger wasn't outside. It was inside the circle of trust. Hidden in plain sight. A possibility too uncomfortable to confront back then, now impossible to ignore. And yet, standing at the beginning of this story, in that quiet apartment in 2001, none of that was visible. All that existed was a missing woman, a stunned neighborhood, and a city pretending it hadn't just blinked and lost someone forever. The label cold case would come later, stamped onto the file like a verdict of uncertainty. For now, there was only the unanswered question echoing through hallways and stairwells, bouncing off brick and concrete, refusing to fade. How does someone disappear without a sound? And more importantly, who was close enough to make sure no one heard it? The question hung in the air long after the police tape came down, long after the patrol cars disappeared from the block, long after neighbors stopped whispering on the stairs, because unanswered questions don't fade, they ferment. And in this case they hardened into suspicion, quiet at first, then sharper with time. Detectives returned to the apartment again and again, replaying the same sequence, the same photographs, the same measurements, as if repetition might reveal a crack they'd missed. They focused on what wasn't there. No forced entry. No defensive wounds. No shattered glass. Whoever took her did not rush. Whoever took her knew the layout, knew the habits, knew exactly how much time they had. In a city where strangers brush shoulders every second, this felt personal, intimate, deliberate. That realization shifted the investigation inward. They mapped her life like a crime scene, tracing routines with red marker across a board that grew crowded but never clearer. Workdays. Commutes. Weekend errands. Phone calls. Coffee stops. Faces that appeared again and again, not because they were suspicious, but because they were familiar. The building superintendent. The neighbor across the hall. The family friend who helped with repairs, who checked in, who everyone trusted without thinking twice. Trust, detectives knew, was both a shield and a blindfold. In interviews, people spoke easily about him, casually, warmly. He'd known her for years. He was practically family. He'd been around the building often. Too often, maybe, but at the time, no one wrote that down in bold. Investigators pulled phone records again, looking for patterns instead of events. Calls that clustered at odd hours. Numbers that appeared frequently, then stopped abruptly. One number stood out, not because it was alarming, but because it was constant. Familiar. Almost invisible. The kind of contact you stop noticing because it's always been there. They noted it, flagged it, then moved on, because nothing about it screamed danger. In 2001, danger was loud. It left marks. It broke things. This case didn't. The search widened. Canvases expanded beyond the block, then beyond the neighborhood. Flyers circulated. Tips poured in, hundreds of them, each one briefly inflating hope before deflating under scrutiny. A woman resembling her spotted on a train. A scream reported weeks too late. A discarded item found blocks away that turned out to belong to someone else entirely. Every false lead cost time, energy, momentum. Every dead end pushed the case closer to that quiet shelf where unsolved files waited. Detectives felt it happening, that slow drift from urgency to routine, from obsession to obligation. Behind closed doors, disagreements surfaced. One theory suggested she'd been lured out voluntarily, tricked by someone she trusted. Another insisted she'd never left the apartment alive. The absence of blood didn't mean the absence of violence, it meant control. It meant planning. It meant someone had cleaned up, or never made a mess in the first place. That idea unsettled even seasoned investigators, because it implied a level of calm that felt incompatible with panic or impulse. Whoever was responsible hadn't snapped. They'd decided. Family members pushed back against the cooling of the case, calling daily, demanding updates, asking the same questions detectives were asking themselves. How could there be no witnesses? How could no one hear anything in a building full of people? The answer, when it came, was always unsatisfying. Cities are noisy. People tune things out. A door closing. Footsteps on stairs. A voice raised briefly, then lowered. All of it blends into the background until it's too late to separate signal from static. The idea that someone could scream without being heard was comforting fiction. Reality was quieter, crueler. As months passed, the investigation turned forensic, revisiting evidence with diminishing returns. Fibers were analyzed, then reanalyzed. Fingerprints lifted from surfaces everyone touched. Nothing excluded anyone. Nothing conclusively included anyone either. The evidence pointed everywhere and nowhere at once. Detectives circled back to the people closest to her, conducting follow-up interviews that grew more pointed with time. Familiar faces began to bristle, offended by the implication that trust might not equal innocence. Some cooperated. Some grew defensive. The family friend remained calm throughout, answering questions smoothly, offering help, expressing concern in ways that sounded exactly right. What investigators couldn't articulate yet was the feeling that something about that calmness was off. Not wrong. Not suspicious in a way you could write into a report. Just polished. Too prepared. In the early days, that instinct was easy to dismiss. Everyone reacts differently. Grief looks like 100 things. You don't build a case on vibes. You build it on facts. And the facts were thin. The case officially went cold sometime in the mid-2000s, though no one ever stood up and announced it. It simply stopped moving. Leads dried up. Budgets shifted. New crimes demanded attention. The file remained, thick and unsatisfying, a monument to questions without answers. New detectives inherited it like a burden, flipping through pages, shaking their heads, closing it again. To them, it was history. To the family, it was a wound that never sealed. Years changed the city. Buildings renovated. Tenants moved. The block where she disappeared filled with new faces who didn't know her name, didn't recognize her photo on aging flyers taped to utility poles. The apartment was rented again. Life resumed its relentless pace. But the case lingered in databases, waiting for something external to shift. And something did, slowly, quietly, in labs far from that third-floor walk-up. Advances in forensic science began to rewrite old assumptions. DNA, once a whisper, became a shout. Samples once considered unusable were suddenly viable. Databases expanded, linking cases across jurisdictions, across decades. Cold cases everywhere began to stir, some solved overnight by a single match, others reopened only to disappoint again. This case was flagged for review not because of a new tip, but because technology had finally caught up to questions investigators couldn't answer before. When the file was reopened in earnest, the focus narrowed with intention. Detectives approached it not as a mystery to brainstorm, but as a problem to test. They scrutinized relationships instead of scenarios, behavior instead of speculation. Who had access? Who had opportunity? Who had something to gain, or something to hide? Old interviews were replayed, transcripts read with fresh eyes. What once sounded normal now carried weight. Inconsistencies emerged, not blatant lies, but subtle shifts. Timelines that didn't quite line up. Details volunteered too readily, or not at all. The family friend's name resurfaced, no longer as background noise, but as a point of interest. His proximity, once comforting, now felt excessive. His presence in her life was constant, overlapping with key moments before her disappearance. In 2001, that closeness had protected him from scrutiny. 2 decades later, it did the opposite. Familiarity no longer equaled innocence. It meant access. Still, nothing moved fast. Cold case work is patient, methodical, almost surgical. Detectives knew better than to rush toward a conclusion, especially one so unsettling. Accusing someone embedded in the fabric of a family required certainty, not suspicion. They returned to the evidence again, this time with tools that hadn't existed before. Samples were sent to labs. Results trickled back. Some eliminated possibilities. Others narrowed them. The net tightened slowly, deliberately, until one name refused to disappear. By then, 20 years had passed. Memories faded. Alibis calcified into stories people told themselves so often they believed them. The community, long numb, began to stir as whispers resurfaced. A cold case, once dormant, was breathing again. And with each breath, the past edged closer to the present, dragging secrets with it, secrets that had survived for decades precisely because they hid behind trust. By the time the investigation reached its third life, it no longer felt like a search for a missing woman, it felt like an excavation, slow and careful, each layer peeled back revealing not clarity, but discomfort. Detectives approached the case with a restraint born from failure. They knew how easily certainty could slip away if they pushed too hard, too fast. Instead, they let the evidence speak in fragments. A fiber here. A timestamp there. A recollection, once dismissed as irrelevant, now re-examined under harsher light. The past, they realized, hadn't been silent. They just hadn't known how to listen. The apartment was revisited in memory, reconstructed through photographs and diagrams. The angles of doors. The narrowness of the hallway. The way sound traveled, or didn't. Experts weighed in on what could be done without alerting neighbors, how long it would take to subdue someone quietly, how familiarity reduced resistance. These weren't theories pulled from imagination, they were tested realities, grounded in cases that had come before. The conclusion was unsettling in its simplicity. If the person at the door was someone she trusted, the barrier to entry wasn't a lock. It was belief. Attention returned to that final stretch of time, the hours before she vanished. Phone records were layered with new data, analyzed not just for calls made, but for calls avoided. Patterns emerged. A gap where communication abruptly stopped. A moment when her routine fractured. Investigators asked themselves what could interrupt someone so predictable without raising alarm. The answer pointed, again, to familiarity. A knock she wouldn't ignore. A voice she wouldn't question. The absence of a struggle wasn't evidence of safety, it was evidence of persuasion. Witness statements, once read for content, were now read for tone. Inconsistencies surfaced not as contradictions, but as edits. Stories smoothed over time, sharpened in places, blurred in others. The family friend's account stood out not because it changed dramatically, but because it didn't change at all. The same phrases. The same emphasis. The same careful framing. Detectives knew that memory degrades, details slip, emotions intrude. Perfect recall, decades later, wasn't impressive. It was suspicious. They dug into his history, cautiously at first, aware of the gravity of what they were suggesting. Financial records revealed nothing explosive, but they revealed proximity, transactions near her neighborhood, patterns of movement that placed him close to her life more often than he'd acknowledged. Work records were checked, schedules compared. Small discrepancies appeared, the kind that mean nothing alone, but together begin to outline opportunity. He hadn't been where he said he was. Not conclusively elsewhere. Just nearby. The lab results arrived quietly, without ceremony. DNA, partial and degraded, but not useless. A trace found years earlier, catalogued and shelved because it couldn't be matched at the time, now had a voice. The database search didn't return a name immediately, but it narrowed the field, excluding strangers, excluding random intruders. The odds shifted. The possibility that this was an outside job grew thinner with every calculation. This wasn't a crime that came from nowhere. It came from within. Detectives revisited the family, careful not to ignite panic or false hope. They asked questions they'd asked before, but in a different order, with different emphasis. They watched reactions, not for guilt, but for recognition. The room grew heavy when the family friend's name was mentioned, not with accusation, but with confusion. He'd been around after the disappearance. He'd comforted them. He'd helped search. The idea that he could be connected felt like a betrayal layered on top of loss, and detectives knew that if they were wrong, the damage would be permanent. Still, the case pressed forward. Subpoenas were issued quietly. Old devices were requested, then replaced with newer ones when originals no longer existed. Digital footprints, once faint, now told richer stories. Location data painted movements that words never could. The picture wasn't complete, but it was coherent enough to raise alarms. He had been close. Too close. At the wrong time. When detectives finally brought him in again, it wasn't for confrontation. It was for conversation. They spoke calmly, methodically, letting silence do its work. They asked about routine, about memories, about details most people forget. His answers flowed easily, practiced, almost rehearsed. He volunteered information that hadn't been requested, filled gaps before they were acknowledged. To an untrained ear, it sounded helpful. To detectives, it sounded like control. They didn't accuse him. Not yet. They didn't need to. The goal wasn't a confession, it was confirmation. They watched for slips, for moments where certainty cracked. There were a few. A timeline compressed here. An assumption made there. Nothing explosive. Nothing definitive. But enough to confirm what they already suspected. He knew more than he should. Outside the interrogation room, the city carried on, unaware that a ghost was beginning to take shape. A cold case, once dormant, was aligning itself around a single figure, no longer protected by time or trust. The danger, once hypothetical, was becoming personal. And as investigators closed their files for the night, one thought lingered, heavy and unavoidable. If the truth had been this close all along, hidden in plain sight, how many years had been lost simply because no one wanted to believe it? The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in, slow and relentless, the way certainty does when it no longer needs to announce itself. Detectives began building the case backward, starting not from the disappearance, but from the silence that followed it, the careful way nothing ever surfaced. They asked a question that hadn't been asked enough in 2001, who benefited most from the absence of answers? Not financially. Not socially. But psychologically. Who gained control the moment she vanished? They examined his behavior after the fact, the days and weeks that followed the report. He had been present, visibly so, at searches and vigils, offering rides, making calls, standing just close enough to be useful without drawing attention. At the time, it looked like loyalty. In hindsight, it looked like management. He knew who was talking to whom. He knew what police were asking. He positioned himself at the center of information, not out of grief, but out of necessity. You don't monitor a narrative unless you're afraid of where it might go. Detectives pulled surveillance footage from nearby streets, archival copies preserved by chance, forgotten in municipal storage. The images were grainy, incomplete, but patterns emerged. A familiar figure crossing familiar routes. A presence near the building at times he claimed to be elsewhere. None of it showed a crime. None of it showed her. But it contradicted statements made under oath years earlier, and contradiction, in cold case work, is oxygen. They reconstructed the likely sequence of events with forensic consultants, not to dramatize, but to test feasibility. The conclusion was chillingly efficient. A knock. A brief exchange. A reason to step inside or step out. A moment of vulnerability. Control established quickly, quietly. The city wouldn't have noticed. The building wouldn't have noticed. The absence of witnesses wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a design. Attention turned to disposal, the question everyone avoided because it led into darkness. No body. No location. No confession. Investigators studied his movements in the days after, cross-referencing travel records, toll data, fuel purchases. Long drives explained away as errands. Gaps in timelines smoothed over by memory. Places that had since changed, developed, erased. The city and its outskirts had swallowed countless secrets over the years. This one, they feared, might be among them. The lab work continued in parallel, patient and unforgiving. New techniques extracted more from what had once been considered dead samples. The DNA profile sharpened, still partial, but increasingly specific. It couldn't name him outright, not yet, but it placed him in a narrowing circle that excluded coincidence. Probability replaced speculation. Math replaced instinct. The numbers didn't scream, but they whispered insistently, the kind of whisper you can't unhear once it starts. Prosecutors were brought in early, consulted quietly, warned not to rush. A case like this could not afford theatrics. 20 years of silence meant 20 years of defense arguments, alternative theories, reasonable doubt sharpened by time. Every piece had to stand alone and still point in the same direction. Circumstantial didn't mean weak, but it meant fragile. One crack could collapse everything. They re-interviewed secondary witnesses, people who had brushed against the case without realizing it. A coworker who remembered an odd comment. A neighbor who recalled seeing him carry something heavy down the stairs, dismissed at the time as trash. Memory is unreliable, but when separate memories align, even loosely, they form shape. The shape wasn't flattering. It suggested preparation. It suggested aftermath. Meanwhile, the family lived in a limbo that never truly ended. They were informed, carefully, that the case was active again, that progress was being made. Hope returned reluctantly, like someone stepping onto ice they'd fallen through before. They asked the same question they'd asked for years, will we finally know? Detectives couldn't answer. Knowing and proving are not the same thing. Justice moves slower than truth, and sometimes it never catches up. The man at the center of it all sensed the shift before anyone told him. He became cautious. Less visible. Fewer check-ins. His cooperation cooled, not enough to be suspicious, just enough to create distance. It was a familiar pattern. When pressure rises, control tightens. Detectives watched quietly, documenting everything, waiting for a mistake. Time, they believed, was no longer on his side. Behind closed doors, the theory solidified. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't an argument gone wrong. It was an act rooted in obsession, entitlement, the belief that proximity equaled ownership. She wasn't a stranger. She was someone he thought he knew well enough to decide her fate. That realization reframed every earlier interaction, every remembered smile, every helpful gesture. The horror wasn't just what had happened. It was how long it had hidden behind normalcy. As the pieces aligned, one obstacle remained immovable. Without a body, without a clear scene of violence, the case lived and died on inference. Prosecutors hesitated, not because they doubted the theory, but because they feared the cost of being wrong. A failed prosecution would freeze the case forever. The stakes were absolute. Either they waited for something stronger, or they risked losing everything. So they waited. They watched. They refined. They prepared. And somewhere in that waiting, the past and present finally collided. A new lab result. A revised interpretation. A link that had not existed before. The kind of development that doesn't announce itself loudly, but lands with weight, shifting the entire balance of the case. The cold case was no longer just breathing. It was standing up. The shift came quietly, the way breakthroughs often do in cold cases, not with a confession or a dramatic discovery, but with a recalculation. A forensic analyst revisited the DNA profile one more time, running it through an expanded database that didn't exist a decade earlier. The result wasn't a perfect match, not the kind that ends debates instantly, but it was close enough to redraw the map. A familial connection. A statistical gravity that pulled the investigation toward a single bloodline, a single circle of relationships. Probability narrowed. Coincidence weakened. The circle tightened. Detectives treated the development with caution. Familial DNA is powerful, but it's also dangerous if mishandled. It can point you in a direction without telling you exactly where to stop. They built a family tree quietly, painstakingly, cross-referencing public records, birth certificates, marriages, relocations. Names repeated. Patterns emerged. And there he was again, not as an outlier, but as a convergence point. Too many lines led back to him for comfort. They returned to physical evidence with new purpose. Items once dismissed as unremarkable were examined again, this time with sharper tools and sharper questions. A fiber matched to a material he owned. A trace consistent with prolonged contact. None of it was cinematic. None of it would make headlines on its own. But together, it began to feel heavy, cumulative, like a weight pressing down on the only conclusion that made sense. Prosecutors grew more involved, their questions more precise. Could the timeline be tightened? Could the inconsistencies be demonstrated clearly to a jury unfamiliar with the nuance of cold case work? Could absence itself be framed as evidence? They weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for inevitability. A narrative that didn't rely on emotion, but on logic so clean it left no room to escape. Investigators rehearsed the case internally, playing devil's advocate, attacking their own theory as aggressively as any defense attorney would. Alternative suspects were re-examined and eliminated again, this time with documentation to prove it. Random abduction scenarios were dismantled piece by piece. No comparable crimes in the area. No credible sightings beyond the first days. No financial motive for anyone else. The case didn't just point toward him. It rejected everyone else. They brought him in once more, not under arrest, not even under formal suspicion, but under the guise of clarification. The interview room felt different this time. Smaller. Colder. The questions were narrower, less forgiving. When confronted with discrepancies, he smiled, adjusted, corrected himself smoothly. But something had changed. The confidence was still there, but it was brittle. He was answering the questions, but he was also listening for traps. Detectives watched his body language, not for guilt, but for calculation. When timelines were challenged, he paused longer than before. When evidence was hinted at, he asked questions instead of offering explanations. He was adapting, and adaptation, under pressure, can reveal more than panic. The interview ended without fireworks, but with confirmation. He understood the net was closing. He just didn't know how tight it already was. Outside the room, the decision loomed. Charge or wait? Move now, or risk losing momentum? The prosecutors weighed the evidence against the reality of a jury hearing a case with no body, no crime scene, no confession. They imagined the defense narrative, grief misinterpreted, science overstated, coincidences dressed up as certainty. They knew the risks. But they also knew something else. Time was no longer neutral. Every year that passed eroded memories, degraded evidence, softened urgency. Waiting carried its own danger. The family was briefed again, this time with more substance. Words like likely and significant entered the conversation. Caution remained, but so did resolve. For the first time in decades, there was a sense that the story might finally move forward, that the question haunting them could shift from what happened to who will answer for it. Hope, fragile and sharp, returned. Then came the moment that forced a decision. A minor, almost overlooked inconsistency surfaced in a routine review, a detail so small it might have been dismissed if not for everything that came before it. A statement made years earlier about a specific object, a specific time, that no longer aligned with the reconstructed sequence. It wasn't proof. But it was wrong. And being wrong, in a case built on precision, mattered. Prosecutors authorized the next step. Warrants were drafted. Evidence was organized. The case was no longer theoretical. It was procedural. Every document, every exhibit, every timeline was locked in. The charge wouldn't be dramatic. It wouldn't satisfy the hunger for spectacle. But it would be real. A line drawn after 22 years of silence. As word of the arrest began to circulate internally, the weight of it settled over everyone involved. This wasn't just about solving a cold case. It was about rewriting a past that had been allowed to calcify into uncertainty. The city that had once blinked and lost someone was about to be reminded of what it had forgotten. And for the man who had lived 2 decades in the shadow of an unanswered question, the moment he had managed so carefully was finally arriving. The arrest didn't come with sirens or spectacle. There was no dramatic chase, no crowd gathered behind police tape. It happened quietly, almost politely, the way consequences often arrive after years of patience. Detectives knocked on his door with warrants folded neatly in their pockets, voices steady, expressions unreadable. He listened. He nodded. He asked one clarifying question, then another. When the cuffs went on, it wasn't shock that crossed his face, but recognition. As if a long-delayed appointment had finally been kept. News broke within hours. A New York 2001 cold case, solved. Family friend charged after 22 years. Headlines moved fast, compressing decades of uncertainty into a few sharp lines. The community reacted with disbelief, then with a slow, creeping horror as the name sank in. This wasn't a stranger pulled from obscurity. This was someone people remembered. Someone they had trusted. Someone who had stood beside them at vigils, who had spoken softly about hope when hope was all that was left. The shock wasn't just that an arrest had been made. It was who. Inside the precinct, the mood was restrained. There were no celebrations, no sense of victory. Only focus. Charging someone in a case like this was the beginning of a new battle, not the end of an old one. Detectives reviewed every step, anticipating the scrutiny to come. Defense attorneys would pull at every thread. Media would amplify every doubt. They had to be ready for all of it. A cold case solved on paper could still freeze solid in a courtroom. Interrogation resumed, this time with a different tone. The questions were no longer exploratory. They were declarative. Evidence was placed on the table, not all of it, just enough to signal that the landscape had changed. He listened, eyes forward, hands folded. When asked about the inconsistencies, he corrected them calmly, almost reflexively. When confronted with the DNA, he leaned back slightly, considering. There was no confession. There didn't need to be. Silence, in this context, was louder than denial. Prosecutors began shaping the narrative they would present to a jury, aware of how fragile truth can feel when filtered through time. They focused on access. Opportunity. Behavior before and after the disappearance. They emphasized patterns over moments, consistency over drama. This was not a story about rage or chaos. It was about control, about proximity, about the quiet certainty that no one would look too closely because no one ever had. The defense moved quickly, as expected. Statements were released, asserting innocence, questioning the reliability of decades-old evidence, warning against the dangers of hindsight bias. They framed the arrest as a tragic misinterpretation, a rush to closure driven by public pressure. The absence of a body became their central pillar. Without proof of death, they argued, there could be no proof of murder. It was a familiar strategy, and a powerful one. The family listened from the edges, pulled once again into a process that asked them to relive everything. They watched the coverage, heard the speculation, felt the old wounds reopen. Relief mixed with dread. An arrest didn't guarantee answers. It didn't guarantee peace. It only guaranteed that the story would be told again, this time in a courtroom where every detail would be examined, challenged, possibly dismissed. They braced themselves for another long wait. As the case moved toward trial, detectives revisited the timeline yet again, refining it down to minutes. They walked through the likely sequence, step by step, aligning evidence with behavior. The picture was stark. A trusted presence. A moment of isolation. A disappearance so clean it defied intuition. The years that followed, marked by careful normalcy. No confessions. No slips. Just time, stretching on, until technology and persistence finally caught up. Experts were lined up. Forensic analysts prepared to explain probabilities to jurors unfamiliar with DNA statistics. Behavioral specialists readied themselves to discuss grooming, manipulation, the way trust can be weaponized. The goal was clarity, not persuasion. To show, patiently, how ordinary interactions can hide extraordinary harm. Outside, the city absorbed the news and moved on, as it always does. But beneath the surface, something shifted. People looked differently at familiar faces. They reconsidered old assumptions. The case became a cautionary tale whispered in conversations about trust and proximity, about how danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. As trial preparations intensified, one truth settled heavily over everyone involved. Even if the jury convicted, even if the case was declared officially solved, there would always be something missing. A body never found. A final moment never witnessed. Closure, in cases like this, is partial at best. Justice can answer some questions, but it cannot restore what was taken or erase the years lived in uncertainty. And yet, the momentum was undeniable. After 22 years, the case had moved from file to courtroom, from silence to accusation. The cold case label, once a mark of failure, now signaled persistence. The story was no longer just about a disappearance. It was about what time reveals, and what it cannot hide forever. The courtroom felt smaller than the case deserved, a narrow chamber where decades of silence were expected to speak all at once. Wood paneling absorbed sound, fluorescent lights flattened emotion, and 12 jurors took their seats carrying the quiet weight of responsibility they hadn't asked for. For them, this wasn't history. It was a puzzle handed over in fragments, each piece aged, worn, demanding belief across time. The prosecution understood the risk. In a case like this, persuasion wasn't about passion. It was about patience. They opened with absence. Not as weakness, but as design. They described a disappearance so clean it required intention, a lack of chaos that spoke louder than violence ever could. They walked the jury through the apartment as it had been found, every untouched object a testament to familiarity. This wasn't a break-in. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone who belonged there. Someone who could enter without resistance and leave without noise. The word cold case hung in the air, no longer a label of neglect, but of endurance. Witnesses followed, one by one, each adding a strand to a rope the prosecution hoped would hold. Friends spoke about routine, about predictability, about how out of character the disappearance was. Investigators described early missteps, not defensively, but honestly, acknowledging the limits of 2001, the tools that hadn't existed yet. They framed the delay not as failure, but as context. The truth, they argued, had always been there. It just hadn't been readable. The defense countered with doubt, carefully planted and carefully tended. They reminded jurors of what was missing. No body. No confession. No eyewitness. They warned against the seduction of narrative, the human tendency to connect dots even when those dots might not belong together. They questioned the reliability of memory after 20 years, the danger of retrofitting meaning onto ordinary behavior. Familiarity, they insisted, was not evidence. Trust was not guilt. The DNA testimony was the pivot. experts took the stand, translating statistics into language meant to be understood without losing precision. They spoke of partial profiles, of probability, of exclusion. They explained how science had evolved, how evidence once considered inert could now speak. The defense pressed hard, highlighting margins of error, emphasizing what the DNA could not say. The jury listened, pens moving slowly, faces unreadable. Then came behavior. Not motive, not confession, but pattern. The prosecution laid out timelines, pointing to inconsistencies that grew sharper when stacked together. They highlighted his presence after the disappearance, the way he inserted himself into searches, into information flows, into grief. They argued that this wasn't compassion. It was control. The defense objected, framing it as speculation, as hindsight bias. The judge allowed it, with caution. Let the jury decide what weight to give it. The family sat behind the prosecution, silent, eyes fixed forward. They had waited decades for this moment, and now that it had arrived, it felt unreal, almost invasive. Strangers were dissecting a life they had loved, reducing it to exhibits and timelines. Every mention of her name carried a tremor. Every photograph felt like both proof and loss. As the days stretched on, the case grew denser, heavier. Jurors were asked to imagine silence, to accept that violence doesn't always announce itself. They were asked to believe that the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence, but of intention. The prosecution closed by returning to the core question: who had the access, the opportunity, and the ability to make someone disappear without a trace? They didn't say his name loudly. They didn't need to. The defense's closing was sharp, urgent. They spoke of reasonable doubt as a safeguard, not a loophole. They warned that convicting without certainty would replace one tragedy with another. They asked jurors to imagine living under suspicion for decades, to consider the cost of being wrong. Emotion rippled through the room, not as tears, but as tension, thick and unresolved. When deliberations began, the courtroom emptied slowly. The case moved behind closed doors, into a space where no cameras followed, where 12 people would argue quietly over evidence older than some of them. Outside, reporters waited. The city waited. The family waited. And somewhere, the man at the center of it all waited too, facing a future that had narrowed suddenly, dramatically, after 22 years of freedom lived in the shadow of a question that had finally found a voice. No one knew how the jury would decide. Cold cases carry a particular weight, the burden of time pressing on every fact. What was clear, unmistakably, was that the silence that began in 2001 had finally been broken. Whatever the verdict, the story could no longer be ignored. Deliberations stretched on in a way that felt cruelly familiar to everyone who had lived with this case for years. Time, once again, became elastic. Hours passed without word. Then days. Jurors requested transcripts, asked for evidence to be replayed, returned to timelines as if walking a maze they hoped would rearrange itself if traced enough times. Inside that room, the past and present collided repeatedly, facts competing with doubt, probability wrestling with certainty. Outside, the waiting resumed, heavy and exhausting, a ritual the family knew too well. The prosecution could do nothing now but watch. Their case lived or died on how clearly the jury could see intention where there was no body, design where there was no blood. The defense, equally silent, trusted in the power of uncertainty, in the idea that absence would outweigh inference. Cold cases are unforgiving that way. They ask jurors to believe in what isn't there, to accept that silence can be evidence, that restraint can be violence. Not everyone can make that leap. Inside the jury room, discussions circled the same pressure points. Access. Opportunity. Behavior. Science. Some jurors focused on the DNA, seeing in it a modern voice cutting through old fog. Others hesitated, uneasy with probabilities that didn't feel absolute. A few returned repeatedly to the same question: if this was murder, where was the body? It wasn't skepticism born of malice, but of caution, the kind the justice system depends on. And yet, every time that question surfaced, another followed close behind. If not him, then who? The defense's narrative gained traction with some, not because it was compelling, but because it was simpler. No body meant no crime proven beyond doubt. Familiarity meant nothing. Behavior could be misread. Time corrupted memory. The prosecution's narrative, by contrast, required synthesis. It required seeing the pattern rather than the parts, trusting that the convergence of evidence meant more than any single piece alone. It asked jurors to accept that some crimes are designed to look like nothing at all. When the jury returned to the courtroom for clarification, the air shifted. Faces were drawn. Voices careful. The judge answered questions about legal standards, about what constituted reasonable doubt, about how to weigh circumstantial evidence. No guidance on facts. No hint of direction. Just the reminder that the decision belonged entirely to them. The family watched closely, searching for signs in posture and expression, trying to read the future in strangers' faces. Hope rose and fell with every movement. 22 years of waiting had taught them not to trust momentum, not to assume progress meant resolution. They knew better than anyone how easily certainty could slip away. The defendant sat still, eyes forward, composed in a way that had become familiar. If fear was there, it stayed hidden. This was not his first time waiting. He had lived with the possibility of this moment for decades, shaping his life around it, building a normalcy that could withstand scrutiny. Whatever the verdict, that normalcy was already gone. The question now was whether it would be replaced with accountability. When deliberations resumed, the jury moved faster, conversations sharpened by exhaustion and urgency. Lines were drawn, then redrawn. Some jurors shifted. Others held firm. The debate narrowed to a single axis. Was the totality of the evidence enough to overcome the absence of a body? The law said it could be. Conscience demanded certainty. Late in the afternoon, the note came. A verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled again, tension compressing the space until it felt almost unbreathable. Reporters leaned forward. The family held hands. The defendant rose when instructed, his expression unreadable, his posture unchanged. The foreperson spoke slowly, deliberately. Each word landed with weight accumulated over decades. Guilty on some counts. Not guilty on others. The specifics blurred in the immediate aftermath, eclipsed by the reality that the case had crossed a line it could never uncross. The cold case, once defined by silence, now carried a judgment. Reactions were muted, restrained by disbelief and shock. There was no release, no clean exhale. Conviction did not deliver answers. It did not reveal where she was, or how her final moments unfolded. It only confirmed what investigators had come to believe years earlier, that the truth had been close, painfully close, all along. Sentencing would come later. Appeals would follow. Legal arguments would continue, stretching the case even further into the future. Justice, like time, moved slowly. But something fundamental had shifted. The story was no longer suspended in question marks. It had an ending of sorts, incomplete and unsatisfying, but real. Outside the courthouse, the city moved past, indifferent and loud. Cars honked. Pedestrians checked their phones. Life continued, unaware of the weight carried out those doors. For the family, for the community, for everyone who had followed the case, the verdict didn't close a chapter. It underlined one truth that would linger long after the headlines faded. Some mysteries are solved without ever being fully explained, and some answers, once found, only deepen the silence they were meant to break. Sentencing arrived without ceremony, folded into the calendar like any other obligation, but nothing about it felt routine. The courtroom was quieter this time, stripped of the suspense that had fueled the trial, replaced by something heavier and harder to name. Finality, maybe. Or the closest thing to it the system could offer. The judge spoke in measured tones, referencing statutes, precedents, years. Numbers were read aloud, years to be served, conditions imposed, but numbers have a way of sounding abstract when they're meant to account for a life erased. The defendant listened, face composed, hands resting calmly on the table. He did not look back. He did not speak. Whatever story he had rehearsed for decades ended here, not with an explanation, but with a consequence. The sentence did not answer the question everyone still carried. It didn't tell them where she was. It didn't tell them what she saw or heard in her final moments. It simply acknowledged that what happened mattered enough to punish someone for it. Appeals followed almost immediately, as expected. Legal briefs challenged the science, the inferences, the very idea that a case without a body could sustain a conviction. The arguments were technical, dense, designed to chip away at certainty one paragraph at a time. Each filing reopened the wound, dragged the family back into the orbit of a story they wanted desperately to escape. Closure, they learned again, was not a single event. It was a series of negotiations with grief. Media attention surged, then faded, then surged again with every new development. Podcasts dissected the case, hosts debating theories with the confidence of distance. Comment sections filled with certainty and doubt in equal measure. Some praised the persistence of investigators. Others questioned the verdict, uneasy with the idea of guilt inferred rather than witnessed. The case became a mirror, reflecting whatever fear or belief the viewer brought to it. Trust no one. Trust the system. Trust the science. Trust your instincts. None of it settled comfortably. Cold case detectives, watching from the sidelines now, felt a complicated mix of vindication and restraint. They knew better than to call this a perfect ending. It was an answer of sorts, but not a complete one. The absence remained. Somewhere, a place existed that no one could point to, no map could mark. The geography of loss was unchanged. The conviction hadn't filled that void. It had only framed it. The family returned home to quiet houses and unanswered questions. They sorted through old photographs again, not for evidence now, but for memory. Birthdays marked by absence. Holidays rearranged around loss. The verdict didn't restore what had been taken, but it shifted the weight slightly, turning suspicion into something solid enough to stand on. They spoke her name more freely, less cautiously, as if the truth, however incomplete, had given them permission to remember without hesitation. Years after the trial, the case continued to surface in unexpected ways. Training seminars for detectives. Law school hypotheticals. A reference point for discussions about circumstantial evidence and evolving forensic science. It became a lesson, not just about persistence, but about humility, about how long the truth can hide, and how easily it can be overlooked when it wears a familiar face. The city itself bore no visible scars. Buildings changed hands. Streets were repaved. New tenants moved into old apartments unaware of what had once unfolded there. New York is generous that way, offering anonymity to grief as readily as it offers opportunity. And yet, beneath the noise, the case lingered, part of the city's unseen history, another story folded into its endless layers. Every so often, someone would ask the question that never went away. Where is she? Investigators had theories, educated guesses shaped by movement patterns and opportunity, but nothing provable. Searches were conducted discreetly over the years, tips followed, areas revisited. Nothing surfaced. The silence held. In the end, the case resisted a clean conclusion. It refused to resolve into a single, satisfying truth. Instead, it settled into something more uncomfortable, more human. A reminder that justice can arrive without clarity, that answers can exist without explanations, that some stories end not with revelation, but with acceptance of what will never be fully known. The cold case was marked as solved in official records, the file closed, the box returned to storage. But for those who lived it, followed it, waded through it, the story remained open in a different way. Not as a mystery to be solved, but as an absence to be carried. And in that absence, the city kept breathing, loud and indifferent, while somewhere beneath the noise, a question continued to echo, unanswered, unanswerable, and impossible to forget. Time did what it always does after a verdict, it thinned the crowd but deepened the echo. Appeals were argued in quieter rooms, far from cameras, where language mattered more than emotion and precedent outweighed pain. Judges reviewed transcripts line by line, parsing decisions made years earlier, measuring science against statute, weighing whether the accumulation of inference had crossed the legal threshold it claimed. Some motions were denied. Others lingered. The machinery of justice kept turning, methodical and impersonal, indifferent to how long the story had already lasted. For the family, each ruling landed like a tremor. Not an earthquake, not relief, just movement, enough to remind them the ground was never fully stable. They learned to live between updates, between headlines, between the possibility that something could still change and the reality that most things would not. The conviction stood, but certainty remained elusive. No confession followed. No map was drawn. The past kept its secrets. Investigators, now mostly observers, watched the case transform into doctrine. It appeared in training manuals as an example of patience, of restraint, of how proximity can masquerade as protection. Younger detectives studied it with clinical interest, noting what was done right, what was done late, what was missed entirely. The lesson wasn't that technology saves everything. It was that people decide what they're willing to see, and when. Trust delays suspicion. Familiarity dulls instinct. Time doesn't reveal truth on its own, it only makes room for it. The defendant adjusted to a life measured in routines he didn't control. Appeals came and went. Years passed. The public image of the case flattened into a headline memory, a solved cold case filed away with others like it. But inside prison walls, time stretched differently, slower, heavier. He maintained his silence. No final statement. No explanation offered for mercy or clarity. Whatever he carried stayed with him, sealed by choice or necessity. Silence, after all, had worked once. Outside, the apartment where it began changed hands again. Walls repainted. Floors replaced. New tenants filled the space with new sounds, unaware of the quiet that once defined it. Cities are efficient that way, recycling space without ceremony. The block looked the same to anyone passing through, but for those who knew, it felt altered, marked by something invisible. Places remember, even when people don't. Occasionally, a tip surfaced. A rumor. A supposed sighting. A late confession whispered secondhand. Detectives followed each one with professional caution, reopening old maps, reviewing old data. Nothing held. The geography of the disappearance remained a blank space, an absence no amount of scrutiny could fill. The city had kept what it was given. Public interest flared again with anniversaries, with documentaries, with podcasts that framed the story anew for audiences too young to remember 2001. Each retelling emphasized different elements, science, betrayal, patience, but all circled the same center. How could something so devastating happen so quietly? How could the answer sit so close for so long? The case endured not because it was exceptional, but because it was plausible. That was its true horror. For the family, remembrance became an act of defiance. They marked birthdays. They spoke her name in rooms where it once felt dangerous to do so. They refused the idea that resolution required completeness. The verdict didn't give them back what they lost, but it gave shape to the loss, edges they could finally touch without fear of denial. Grief didn't end. It evolved. In official records, the file remained closed, stamped and catalogued. Solved. Charged. Convicted. A neat conclusion that fit within databases and annual reports. But the reality resisted compression. This wasn't a story with a final reveal. It was a long unraveling, a reminder that justice can be partial, that truth can arrive late and still leave questions behind. And beneath all of it, the city continued, relentless and loud, absorbing the story into its vast archive of human noise. New cases replaced old ones. New mysteries demanded attention. But every so often, when the streets went quiet just before dawn, when the traffic thinned and the buildings seemed to listen, the echo of that first unanswered question still lingered, suspended in the air. Not demanding an answer anymore. Just insisting on being remembered. In the end, what remained was not a revelation, but a residue, a thin film of unanswered things coating everything the case had touched. Years after the final appeal was denied, after the paperwork was filed and refiled and finally forgotten, the story still resisted rest. It lived on in habits, in pauses, in the way certain names were spoken more softly than others. Justice had moved through the system and come to a stop, but meaning did not follow so neatly behind. The family learned to live alongside the silence rather than fight it. They stopped waiting for phone calls that would never come, stopped imagining scenarios that led to certainty. Instead, they carried memory forward, imperfect but intact. They told stories about who she was, not how she disappeared. Laughter returned to conversations where it once felt forbidden. Grief, reshaped by time, became less sharp, though no less present. The case had taken enough from them. They refused to let it take her humanity too. For investigators who had spent years circling the same questions, the resolution felt incomplete but necessary. They understood something the headlines never could: solving a cold case doesn't mean warming it until everything melts into clarity. Sometimes it means drawing a boundary around what can be known and refusing to let uncertainty erase accountability. The absence of a body no longer defined failure. It defined the crime itself. An act designed to erase, resisted by a system that refused to forget. The city absorbed the story the way it absorbs everything else. Another case folded into another archive. Another lesson embedded in another generation of detectives. The streets where it began hummed with new lives, new urgencies, untouched by the weight beneath their feet. But cities, like people, carry layers. And somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the constant motion, the echo of that disappearance still existed, not as a warning, but as a reminder. True crime audiences would continue to debate it, to argue guilt and doubt with the comfort of distance. Some would call it justice delayed. Others would call it justice compromised. Both would miss the point. This story was never about satisfaction. It was about endurance. About how long a question can survive without an answer. About how close danger can sit to trust, unnoticed, unchallenged, until time itself becomes the witness. The phrase cold case would always trail this story, even after it was marked solved. Not because it lacked a verdict, but because it carried a chill that never fully lifted. A sense that something essential was still missing, somewhere beyond reach. That the truth, while named, had not been completely seen. And so the story ends the way it began. Not with certainty, not with peace, but with quiet. A city breathing. An apartment filled with different voices. A file closed in a cabinet that will eventually be cleared to make room for new questions. Somewhere, a memory held carefully, defiantly, against the erosion of time. No final image. No last revelation. Just the knowledge that some disappearances do not end when the gavel falls, that some answers arrive without closure, and that some stories, once told, continue to linger in the silence that follows, asking nothing, explaining nothing, and refusing, always, to be forgotten. There was never supposed to be a part 12. In the official record, the story had already ended. The case number was stamped closed, the evidence boxed, the narrative reduced to a few rigid lines in a database that would never capture the weight of what had unfolded. But stories like this don't obey paperwork. They continue in the margins, in the aftershocks, in the subtle ways a community learns what it can no longer unsee. In the months that followed, small details began to feel louder than verdicts. A neighbor realized that a sound once dismissed as nothing, a door closing too late, footsteps on stairs that should have been empty now carried a different meaning. A former classmate replayed a conversation from years ago, an offhand remark that suddenly felt loaded, rehearsed, wrong. Memory became unstable, rearranging itself under the pressure of hindsight. Everyone wondered what they had missed, and whether missing it had been inevitable. The accused faded from public view, but not from imagination. Photographs circulated online, frozen expressions dissected by strangers searching for tells, for signs that evil had been hiding in plain sight. Some swore they could see it now, etched in the eyes, in the posture, in the smile that lingered half a second too long. Others pushed back, uneasy with how quickly certainty could be manufactured after the fact. The truth, once revealed, had made everyone a suspect of their own judgment. The investigators moved on to other cases, but this one followed them. It surfaced in training rooms and late-night conversations, in the quiet moments when experience outweighed protocol. They spoke about it not as a triumph, but as a warning. About time. About patience. About the danger of assuming that silence means nothing is happening. They knew now that a cold case isn't dormant, it's waiting, accumulating weight, pressing outward until something finally gives. For the family, the calendar lost its authority. Anniversaries blurred. Dates that once marked progress or hope now passed without ceremony. What mattered instead were moments, a familiar song on the radio, a stranger who shared her laugh, a dream that felt too real to dismiss. They learned that closure is not a door that slams shut, but a window left cracked, letting air in slowly, unevenly. Enough to breathe. Never enough to forget. The city, indifferent but complicit, continued to reinvent itself. Buildings rose where old ones had stood. Streets were renamed. The physical landscape changed so completely that newcomers would never know what had happened there, what absence had once occupied those coordinates. But beneath the asphalt and steel, the past remained intact. Cities don't erase history, they bury it, layer by layer, trusting that weight will do the rest. Every so often, the case resurfaced in the media. A documentary teaser. A podcast episode. A headline recycling the same words, cold case, solved, decades later. Each retelling smoothed the edges a little more, shaping the story into something consumable, something that fit neatly into an hour-long format. But the people who lived it knew better. They knew the story wasn't neat. It was jagged, unresolved in ways no runtime could accommodate. And then there was the question no one liked to ask out loud. Not whether justice had been served, but whether it had arrived too late to matter in the way people imagine it should. Time had altered everything: evidence, memory, relationships, even the meaning of guilt. Accountability had been established, yes. But time had already taken its own sentence from everyone involved, quietly, relentlessly, without appeal. In the end, the cold case didn't teach anyone how to feel safe. It taught them how fragile certainty really is. How easily trust can be misplaced. How disappearance isn't always sudden, it can be incremental, happening in overlooked moments, in assumptions left unchallenged. It taught them that some crimes are designed not just to harm, but to haunt, to stretch their impact across decades. So the story continues, not as an active investigation, not as a headline, but as a presence. A low hum beneath daily life. A reminder that resolution and understanding are not the same thing. That answers can exist without relief. That some truths, once uncovered, don't heal, they simply change the shape of the wound. And somewhere in New York, amid the noise and the motion, the legacy of that cold case endures. Not in files or courtrooms, but in awareness. In the way people hesitate before dismissing the strange, the quiet, the almost forgotten. In the knowledge that even after decades, the past can still reach forward, tap a shoulder, and remind the present that it was never really finished at all. By the time people stopped arguing about what had happened, they had already started arguing about what it meant. That was the quieter afterlife of the case, the phase no one prepares for, when facts harden but interpretation stays fluid. The city talked in fragments. In barrooms and comment sections, on late-night radio and half-listened to podcasts, the story fractured into angles and theories. Not about who did it anymore, but about how something like it could exist for so long without collapsing under its own weight. Some said the case proved the system worked, eventually. Others said it proved the opposite, that time, not justice, had done most of the work. That decay, chance, and persistence had aligned just long enough to force an outcome. The truth sat somewhere in between, uncomfortable and unmoving. Systems don't feel guilt. They don't feel relief either. They process. They record. They wait. For those closest to the center, waiting had become second nature. They had learned how to carry unanswered questions without letting them dominate every room. But the questions never vanished. They simply changed shape. Instead of asking why it happened, they asked what could have stopped it. Instead of asking who failed, they asked how many times they themselves had ignored something because it felt easier to do so. The old apartment was renovated years ago. New paint, new floors, new tenants who had no idea what once pressed against those walls. The layout remained the same, though. The light still fell through the windows at the same angles in the late afternoon. If you stood there long enough, quiet enough, you could almost feel the residue of another life intersecting briefly with your own. Not a ghost. Just a reminder that space remembers even when people don't. Investigators sometimes return to the file in their minds, replaying it the way a musician replays a flawed performance, wondering where the tempo slipped. They knew better than to romanticize it. There were no cinematic breakthroughs, no single clue that should have screamed louder. Just a collection of small, human decisions made under pressure, guided by the information available at the time. The case didn't break because someone was brilliant. It broke because someone, decades later, refused to stop asking. That persistence came at a cost. Careers bent around it. Relationships strained under the long shadow of obsession. Cold cases demand patience, but they also demand sacrifice. They ask people to live with unfinished business, to invest in outcomes they may never see. When one finally resolves, there is no victory parade. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the past has loosened its grip, slightly. The name of the victim still surfaced now and then, usually mispronounced, usually followed by a pause. People didn't know what to say after it. Sorry felt inadequate. Shock felt performative. Silence, once again, became the default. But this silence was different. It wasn't the absence of attention. It was the presence of respect, heavy and deliberate. New York kept moving, as it always does. Trains rattled through tunnels built before anyone involved in the case was born. Sirens cut through nights filled with unrelated emergencies. The city had learned long ago how to absorb tragedy without stopping. It doesn't forget, it just refuses to slow down for grief. That refusal can look like cruelty, but it's also survival. A metropolis cannot mourn every loss the way a family does. It would collapse under the weight. Every cold case leaves behind a map of what was possible at the time. Technology that didn't exist yet. Laws that hadn't been written. Voices that weren't heard because no one was listening in the right way. Looking back, it's tempting to see inevitability. To believe that resolution was always coming, just delayed. But inevitability is a luxury granted only after the fact. Living inside uncertainty feels nothing like destiny. It feels like suspension. As years passed, the case stopped being a headline and became a reference point. A shorthand for conversations about trust, about proximity, about how well we really know the people who orbit our lives. It entered classrooms and lecture halls, used to illustrate how assumptions can calcify into blind spots. It became an example not of evil, but of familiarity. Of how danger rarely announces itself. The family never asked for the story to carry that weight. They didn't ask to become symbols or lessons. They just wanted time to stop rearranging their memories. They wanted a version of the past that didn't feel like it was constantly being edited by new information. That, more than justice, proved elusive. Once a narrative changes, it never settles again. Every recollection becomes provisional. In quiet moments, when the city noise thinned and the day softened at its edges, there was sometimes a sense of proximity. Not to answers, but to acceptance. A recognition that some truths arrive incomplete, and that completeness is not a prerequisite for moving forward. The wound didn't close. It scarred. And scars, unlike open wounds, can be lived with. The phrase cold case lingered like a label that never fully peels off. Even solved, it retained its chill. Not because the facts were in doubt, but because the time between cause and consequence had stretched so far that it altered their relationship. When justice travels slowly, it arrives changed. It doesn't restore what was lost. It only confirms what should have been known. And so the story continues its slow fade, not into obscurity, but into the background radiation of the city. Present, measurable, impossible to eliminate entirely. A low-level reminder that the past is not behind us in a straight line. It loops. It waits. It resurfaces when conditions allow. There is no final lesson here, no clean moral to extract. Only the understanding that some stories resist conclusion. They end on a note that keeps ringing long after the sound should have died away. A cold case, even solved, is still a conversation with time itself, and time, as this story proved, always has the last word. By the time the echoes finally began to thin, what remained was not clarity but a strange familiarity. The case had lived so long in public consciousness that its absence now felt unnatural, like a sound that had stopped abruptly, leaving behind a pressure in the ears. People didn't miss the mystery. They missed the vigilance it had forced upon them, the uneasy awareness that something unresolved was still watching from the edges of ordinary life. In private moments, those who had followed the case closely noticed how it had altered their instincts. They listened differently to stories of disappearance. They hesitated before dismissing coincidences. They paid closer attention to the quiet people in the room, the ones who hovered just outside the spotlight. The cold case had trained them without their consent, rewiring how they understood risk, trust, and time. For the family, life continued in measured steps. Not forward, not backward, but outward. The circle widened slowly, carefully, as they allowed new memories to coexist with old ones. They learned that grief does not demand exclusivity. That it is possible to hold joy without betrayal, laughter without erasure. The absence never shrank, but it stopped expanding. That, in its own way, felt like mercy. There were moments when anger resurfaced, sharp and uninvited. Anger at delays. At missed chances. At how many years it took for a name to finally align with responsibility. But anger, like grief, exhausted itself over time. What replaced it was something quieter, heavier. A recognition that no version of the ending would ever feel adequate. That the damage had been done in increments, spread thinly across decades, impossible to trace to a single failure. The investigators who had inherited the case late in their careers understood this better than anyone. They never spoke about it as a triumph. In their language, there were no victories, only outcomes. The best they could offer was containment. A line drawn in the sand of history, marking where uncertainty stopped growing. They knew that even this line was temporary, subject to reinterpretation, re-examination, doubt. But it was something. And in cold cases, something is often all there is. New technologies would emerge, promising faster answers, cleaner resolutions. Databases would expand. Algorithms would claim to see patterns humans missed. And still, cases like this would linger. Because the hardest part was never the data. It was the waiting. The years in which nothing happened loudly enough to matter. The long stretches where absence itself became the only evidence. The story found its way into lectures, into training manuals, into the quiet warnings passed from veteran detectives to rookies. Pay attention to what feels too normal. Don't confuse familiarity with safety. Don't assume time dulls intent. These were not rules, just scars translated into advice. Sometimes, late at night, the city seemed to acknowledge the weight it carried. In the early hours before dawn, when traffic thinned and voices faded, there was a stillness that felt almost deliberate. As if New York itself paused, briefly, to remember everything it had seen and refused to record. In those moments, the case felt close again, not as a headline, but as a presence woven into the city's muscle memory. The victim's name was no longer new, but it was no longer invisible either. It existed in a narrow space between recognition and reverence. People spoke it carefully, aware now that names can outlast answers. That being remembered, even imperfectly, is its own form of resistance against erasure. There was a temptation, especially in retellings, to frame the story as a warning with a clear message. But real warnings are rarely that tidy. This one whispered instead of shouted. It suggested that danger does not always arrive violently. That it can settle in slowly, wearing the mask of routine, of trust earned over time. That the most unsettling crimes are not those that explode into view, but those that quietly integrate themselves into daily life. As the years pressed on, the case lost its sharp edges and became part of a larger pattern, one thread among many in the long fabric of unresolved harm. It was no longer singular, no longer shocking in isolation. And yet, its power endured precisely because of that. It was ordinary. And that ordinariness was the most disturbing detail of all. Nothing about the ending rewrote the beginning. Nothing about accountability restored what was taken. The case did not resolve into peace. It settled into awareness. A low, constant understanding that some truths arrive too late to heal, but not too late to matter. And somewhere between memory and forgetting, between justice and time, the cold case continued to exist. Not as a question waiting for an answer, but as an answer that refused to quiet the question. By the time the story reached its 15th telling, it had shed almost everything that once made it feel immediate. The urgency was gone. The shock had softened. What remained was weight, dense, accumulated, impossible to ignore if you stopped long enough to feel it. This was no longer a case people followed. It was a case people carried. In conversations, it surfaced unexpectedly. Not as a headline, not even as a reference, but as a pause. Someone would mention trust, or time, or the idea that you never really know anyone, and the silence that followed would say more than the words themselves. Everyone knew which story had taught them that lesson. No one needed to name it anymore. The family rarely spoke publicly now. Not because they had nothing to say, but because everything worth saying had already been said too many times, often by people who had never lived inside the consequences. They learned that retelling can become a second erosion, wearing down memory until it feels less like truth and more like performance. Protecting what remained meant choosing quiet over explanation. Inside that quiet, life continued in fragments. Birthdays acknowledged privately. Traditions adjusted rather than abandoned. There was an understanding among them, unspoken but firm, that the case would never be allowed to define the totality of who she had been. She was not a disappearance. She was a presence that had been interrupted. That distinction mattered. For those who had once searched for answers obsessively, the shift was harder. Letting go felt like betrayal. They had built routines around vigilance, checking updates, revisiting timelines, scanning for anything that might have been missed. When the case stopped producing new information, the absence felt personal, like being dismissed by a story they had invested in for years. Obsession, it turned out, does not dissolve easily. It has to be replaced. Investigators understood this dynamic better than most. They had seen it before. The way cold cases attract a gravity that pulls people inward, promising meaning in exchange for persistence. But meaning is not guaranteed. Sometimes all that comes back is confirmation of loss. They learned to step away not because they stopped caring, but because caring indefinitely is unsustainable. The accused remained a fixed point in the narrative, but even that fixation began to loosen. With time, the focus shifted away from the individual and toward the conditions that allowed everything to unfold the way it did. Access. Opportunity. Silence. Assumptions layered on assumptions until no one questioned the structure anymore. The case became less about a person and more about a pattern. That pattern was uncomfortable. It suggested that the most dangerous element was not malice alone, but normalcy. The way routines dull attention. The way familiarity lowers defenses. The way communities often trust proximity more than evidence. These were not dramatic revelations. They were mundane. And that mundanity was precisely what made them difficult to confront. The city offered no commentary. It never does. It simply continued, absorbing the case into its vast archive of unresolved human stories. Somewhere, a file sat untouched for months at a time, its relevance dormant but intact. The city did not need to remember actively. It remembered structurally, in systems shaped by past failures, in protocols written because something once went wrong. At night, when the pace slowed and the distance between moments stretched, the case sometimes felt closer. Not louder. Just nearer. Like a pressure change before weather shifts. A reminder that resolution does not erase impact. That knowing what happened does not undo the years spent not knowing. People spoke less about justice now and more about cost. What it took to sustain hope across decades. What it took to keep asking when answers seemed unreachable. What it took to accept that some conclusions arrive stripped of satisfaction. These were not questions with clean responses. They lingered, unresolved, much like the case itself had for so long. There was a time when everyone involved believed that an ending would change everything. That clarity would bring relief. That naming responsibility would quiet the noise. By this point, that belief had worn thin. Endings, it turned out, are rarely transformative. They are administrative. Emotional reality moves at a different speed. And so the cold case, even in its later life, continued to teach the same lesson, quietly, relentlessly. That time does not heal by default. That truth is not synonymous with peace. That some stories do not conclude, they simply stop unfolding in public, while privately, they continue to shape the people who lived inside them. Nothing dramatic marked this stage. No revelations. No final turn. Just a gradual settling, like dust after a long collapse. The air clearer, perhaps, but the outlines of what fell still visible, etched into memory, refusing to disappear. By the 16th telling, the story no longer felt like something that happened in the past. It felt like a condition. A state that lingered, subtle but persistent, shaping perception without announcing itself. The case had stopped asking to be remembered. It simply assumed its place, embedded in the way people measured doubt, in the way certainty was handled with more care than before. Those who once spoke with confidence now spoke with qualifiers. They had learned that timelines lie by omission, that memory edits itself without permission, that truth can survive for decades without being visible. The cold case had trained them to distrust clean narratives. To look for what was missing rather than what was presented. To listen for hesitation instead of volume. The family existed in a parallel rhythm. Their lives no longer synced with anniversaries or legal milestones. Those dates had lost their authority. What mattered were the small calibrations of daily living, how to carry absence without letting it tip everything over, how to acknowledge loss without rehearsing it. They understood something few others did, that survival after resolution requires a different kind of strength than survival during uncertainty. There were days when the name resurfaced unexpectedly, spoken by someone who had just discovered the story, eyes wide with late-arriving shock. The family met those moments with practiced restraint. They had learned that first reactions belonged to the listener, not to them. They had lived with the truth long enough to know that astonishment fades quickly. Consequences do not. The investigators who had once chased the case now referenced it less often. Not because it mattered less, but because it had already delivered what it was capable of giving. They carried it quietly, as one carries an old injury that no longer aches but never quite disappears. It informed their instincts. It slowed their certainty. It reminded them that persistence is not heroic, it is necessary. In training rooms, the case became a cautionary absence. Not a story told in full, but a silhouette used to frame discussion. What happens when familiarity masks threat? What happens when time is mistaken for safety? What happens when waiting becomes policy? The answers were never final. They shifted with each new generation, each new failure, each new attempt to do better. Public attention had mostly drifted away by now. New mysteries demanded fresh outrage. New disappearances competed for limited empathy. The cycle continued, efficient and unforgiving. But this case, having already endured the longest stretch of invisibility, did not need attention to persist. It had outlasted relevance once. It could do so again. There was a strange relief in that obscurity. Without the constant retelling, the story could exist without distortion. It no longer needed to perform. It no longer needed to shock. It could simply remain what it was, a record of loss, a demonstration of delay, a reminder of how easily harm can be overlooked when it wears a familiar face. Sometimes, in quiet conversations, someone would ask the question that had never fully gone away. Not who did it. Not why. But how many others were still waiting inside stories like this, unnamed, unresolved, quietly aging alongside their unanswered questions. The case offered no comfort there. Only precedent. The city, indifferent as ever, provided the backdrop. Streets repaved. Buildings replaced. Lives intersected and separated without awareness of what had once occurred nearby. And yet, the city bore the imprint of every story it had absorbed. Not visibly. Structurally. In how it moved forward without asking permission from the past. The cold case no longer demanded belief. It required acknowledgement. A recognition that resolution is not an endpoint, that accountability does not rewind time, that answers can arrive stripped of relief. It asked only that people remember what waiting costs and who pays it. At this stage, the story did not end. It stabilized. It reached a kind of equilibrium between memory and forgetting, between meaning and fatigue. It stopped pulling focus, but it never vanished. Like a scar beneath clothing, unseen but undeniable, shaping movement in ways only the bearer understands. And so it remained, quiet, persistent, unresolved in spirit even if resolved on paper. A cold case that proved warmth was never the goal. Only recognition. Only the refusal to let disappearance become normal. Only the insistence that time, no matter how much passes, does not have the right to erase what it once allowed to happen.